Welcome, folks. My name is Alan, and I'm here with Sean, my co-host at the Prancing Pony Podcast.
While creating our show, we've learned that Tolkien fans take their scholarship seriously, but Tolkien scholars like to have some fun, too.
In fact, the Tolkien community is truly a wonderful blend of fans and scholars together.
That's right. It's why we're always careful to bring scholarship and research into our show to complement our entertaining chapter discussions and inevitable digressions.
They are inevitable, aren't they?
Indeed.
Well, we know that Tolkien fans are always interested in hearing more about their favorite author, but they also love hearing other people share how they found Tolkien. I know I do.
Me too. That's why we are so excited to introduce you to the newest addition to the Tolkien podcasting family, the Tolkien Experience Podcast. For more than a year and a half, Luke Shelton's Tolkien Experience Project has been collecting stories from scholars and fans. Now, we have partnered with him and Dr. Sarah Brown to create the Tolkien Experience Podcast, or TEP.
The TEP is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community, sharing their responses to the original Tolkien Experience Project questions.
It's the only podcast where you'll hear the voices of some of the world's most recognizable Tolkien scholars and fan community leaders as they share about their personal experience with Tolkien.
So if you ever wanted to hear about why Dimitra Fimi's favorite Tolkien books are his children's books,
or how the Tolkien professor discovered Tolkien,
that's right, I forgot about that one, then this is a podcast well worth your time.
So let's get you to your hosts, Luke Shelton and Sarah Brown.
Hello everyone, I'm Sarah.
And I'm Luke. What a great introduction, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Thanks to Alan and Sean from the Prancing Pony Podcast for partnering with us to bring you the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
Our interview this episode is with Dr. Dimitra Fimi. Since it's our first episode, though, I thought we might take just a moment to tell you who we are first.
Okay, hi, I am Dr. Sarah Brown, and I have a PhD in English literature on Tolkien Studies, which makes me an unapologetic nerd. I've been a high school teacher for 25 years, and I currently work full-time at Rydal Penrose School in North Wales, where I teach English to very ungrateful teenagers. I've also been working at Signum University, based in the USA, since 2012, teaching on various fantasy fiction courses, including my own course called Tolkien in Context, Middle-earth as a Roadmap to 20th Century Anxieties, which explored Tolkien's writing as a response to modernity. I'm also the faculty chair of the Department of Language and Literature for Signum, which makes me a ridiculously busy person, but I am really excited to be a part of this Tolkien Experience podcast.
And I am so grateful to have you here with me. Hi there, my name is Luke Shelton, and I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Glasgow. There, my research focuses on the way that young readers respond to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. I love talking to people about their unique experiences with Tolkien, which is exactly why I started the Tolkien Experience Project on my blog at luke-shelton.com. I'm so excited to be starting out on this new podcast with you and to bring unique experiences of Tolkien from scholars and fans to our listeners.
So if you want to know more about us, you can visit tolkienexperience.com. You can also reach out to us on social media and we would love to talk.
In this podcast, our goal is to share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan every other week.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us will ask our special guest 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
These questions are based on the original Tolkien Experience Project, which, just to put in a quick plug, is still going strong and is open to anyone.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you, so without any more delay, let's introduce our guest.
For the first episode of the Tolkien Experience Project, I had the absolute privilege of talking with Dr. Dimitra Fimi. Dr. Fimi is one of the most well-respected Tolkien scholars in the world. You might know her from one of her texts. Her most well-known might be her book Tolkien Race and Cultural History, which won the 2010 Mythopoeic Scholarship Award for Inklings Studies. She's also published a critical edition of Tolkien's A Secret Vice that she co-edited with Andrew Higgins, and for which she won the 2017 Tolkien Society Award for Best Book. In addition to her incredible work in the Tolkien field, she is also a lecturer in fantasy and children's literature at the University of Glasgow. I could not think of a better interviewee to start our podcast, So without further ado, let's jump right into the interview. Dr. Fimi, would you mind telling us how you were introduced to Tolkien's work?
Right, that's a good story, actually. It's got a good story behind it. So I was a student at the University of Athens. I was doing my degree in English language and literature. That's a long time ago. And at the same time, I was working as an English language teacher for my mother's school and for other schools. And I was sent to Britain in one of the summers to accompany a group of Greek students who were learning English to have some summer lessons. And I was just an accompanying teacher, so I had a lot of free time, sort of roam around in the day, and then I was with the students in the afternoon after their lessons. And one of them was reading a very intriguing book, which was green and had a green hooded figure on the front. And, now I know, of course, that it was the Silmarillion with the John Howe Gandalf outside. And I just wanted to know what that was and what was the whole story. And he must have been, I can't remember now, a teenager, I presume. And he said, this is, you really like this, but this isn't where, this isn't the right place to start. You shouldn't go and buy this book. You should go and read The Lord of the Rings. There is a book before it. There is The Hobbit, but you're too old for that, actually. So you go and buy The Lord of the Rings. That's all right. You'll manage with that. And he, he proceeded to tell me about that strange, man who wrote all of this mythology and all of these stories. So I was there already. I was in Britain already. So I walked into a bookstore and I bought The Fellowship of the Ring, which I read straight away in English. My student had the Silmarillion in Greek at the time in his hands. And to be honest, you just open the book, you start reading it, and you fall inside it. It doesn't really need much effort. It didn't in my case anyway, to want to know more. And then I went back to Greece after those 2 weeks, for the summer courses. And I had to order back then, before pre-Amazon days and all that, I had to order the second and the third installment in English via Central Bookstore in Athens. So it was quite a palaver, and I had to wait in between the three volumes, which was quite tough, I can tell you, especially between volume 2 and 3. That was really hard. But it was a revelation. It was something I'd never seen anything like this before. I tried to talk to my professors at the time, my lecturers. Nobody knew anything about it. It was quite a cult thing, I suppose, in Greece to be reading. So it was luck. It was a lucky day and a lucky moment, and a lucky accumulation of circumstances, I suppose.
That sounds like a wonderful story. And I think most of us Tolkien fans know that we only call it luck sometimes. Other times it has another name, but
yes, that's very true. That's very true, indeed. Luck is a good one, though, especially, it's mentioned a lot of times in terms of sort of Bilbo's journey. I've reread The Hobbit recently with my son, so the word luck sort of jumped out at me a number of times. When you read it aloud, it suddenly resonates in a different way. So. Mm-hmm.
Was that your fondest experience of Tolkien's work, or does another one stand out to you?
No, that's a tough one. That's a really difficult one, because I'm reading Tolkien is what I do for a living, sort of. It's an unusual thing to say, but I am a lecturer in fantasy and children's literature. A lot of what I do is teaching those texts, and I teach Tolkien every year. But at the same time, I write on Tolkien and I research Tolkien, and I go and work with his manuscripts at times, and I've edited Tolkien. So it's very, very difficult to talk about favorite, because that seems to change in different phases of my life. So for a while, my favorite was the Book of Lost Tales, because it gave me that very fresh vision of how Tolkien was thinking about an emerging mythology in a very early period of his life, and all of the creative juices were there. And I still think it's a brilliant, brilliant text, very different to the later Silmarillion. At the moment, I'd probably say his children's books are my favorite, because that's what I'm spending most of my time reading aloud with my son. So as I was saying before, we've just gone through The Hobbit. It was quite an experience, going through Roverandom, Father Christmas letters, all of those, reading those actually with a child of around the same age as Tolkien's children when he was writing them, makes it quite striking and and magical, in a way that I don't think I'd thought of those texts before. I mean, I knew there were children's texts, but it's different when you have the touchstone of a child right there when you're reading them again.
Which of your times revisiting Tolkien has kind of left the biggest impact on you?
I think I'm going to have to say those moments in the Bodleian when I was looking at Tolkien's manuscripts, and especially when certain things that were unexpected were found in his manuscripts. So Andrew Higgins and I worked on an edition of A Secret Vice, as I'm sure you know. And there were hours and hours, spent at the Bodleian trying to decipher Tolkien's handwriting, which isn't always the easiest to read. Often, with pencil, which means it's very faint. It's very old and very faint and very frail, or very frail paper very often. But it's those little discoveries of things that you didn't expect. So one of the most striking ones and fondest ones at the moment, again, I'm sure if you ask me in 5 years' time, I'll tell you a different one, was reading through Tolkien's very hasty notes and sort of disjointed pieces of paper around the Secret Vice folder, and finding a reference to James Joyce, which was, it was a surprise, but I knew he had already referred to Joyce before, so not that big a surprise. But within the same couple of pieces of paper, finding the name of another sort of modernist avant-garde writer, which was completely unexpected. And I was staring at the piece of paper thinking, I'm not seeing this really, I'm making this up. And that was Gertrude Stein, who, you couldn't really think of a more unlikely person as a personality or in terms of politics that Tolkien could have been aware of. But clearly he was, and clearly he was sort of engaging with what she was doing with language at the time. So that was quite a revelation when suddenly I thought, yeah, I'm not making this up. This isn't my eyes sort of deceiving me. This is actually the name of a modernist or avant-garde contemporary.
That's incredible. I can't imagine kind of getting firsthand validation of something that you had already suspected, but there it is in his own handwriting.
Can't get any better than that.
I imagine because you work with Tolkien so much, you have evolved the way that you approach his work a lot over time. Can you think of some of the ways that your approach might have changed over time?
Yes. I think, going back to that story I told at the beginning, I think I was reading as just a general reader, reading for pleasure, and I was a much younger person as well, and not a native speaker of English. So a lot of that first reading of Tolkien was an example of discovery, and often discovering things like vocabulary, words I didn't know, and trying to work through, how detailed or how complex his world was, and then slowly sort of finding all of the background and reading that. So that first time it was very much a discovery time. I suppose later came the more critical reading, the reading where I was thinking about all of the things I wanted to say, all of the things that hadn't been said about Tolkien that I felt somebody had to say. And that was more about thinking of his context, his cultural, his intellectual context. This wasn't just a man who was sort of living in the Middle Ages because of his day job. This was somebody who lived in the 20th century and was very much influenced by and shaped by and used echoes of what was going on around him. So that was a very different a way of working with Tolkien that was very systematic, very detailed, very analytical. But at the same time, there were those flights of, glimpses of things that just happened. It was, again, sometimes luck. You wouldn't expect to find resonances. So, for example, the way that Tolkien understood the fairies, or the different theories of fairy lore that existed in the late 19th century, and how some of those fed into his early development of the elves, or how, for example, I went to Birmingham and found the exact details, even the playbill and the reviews of the exact play of Peter Pan that he saw when he was a young man at Birmingham. Those sorts of things. It was an enriching, I suppose, experience. It was reading as a critic and reading as a scholar, but discovering and filling in gaps and understanding more, I think, that grand vision. I think now I'm also working with Tolkien as a teacher, and I'm also working with a much broader range of things. I suppose when you're doing a PhD, when you're first doing your first sort of critical work, you tend to be quite focused on one area, one approach, or one particular, doable project. But now I've said a lot of the things I wanted to say, and now I can just do whatever, So the talk I gave at Tolkien 2019 on Tolkien folklore and foxes. That was something I wouldn't have even dreamt of doing 10 years ago. And it was sort of bringing very disparate areas together. But somehow, now that all of this background is in my head, it's sort of brewing for a while, all sorts of unlikely links come together. So, yeah, this is the fun period, I think, where I get to do all of the crazy things. So there you are.
For any of our listeners who are unaware, that talk from Tolkien 2019 is available on YouTube, posted by the Tolkien Society. And it was a fantastic talk and a very fun talk, so I can't recommend that one highly enough.
Thanks, Luke. It was fun to give, actually, and I was hoping that people would join in the singing, but you can't be sure that that's going to happen. So I was so glad everybody joined in. That was great.
Well, when you get a group of Tolkien fans together, of course we're going to sing.
Great.
The last question that I normally ask in the text-based project is whether or not respondents would ever recommend Tolkien's work. Mm-hmm. And I thought, because of your unique perspective, I kind of wanted to split that into two different questions if I could.
Okay.
Do you ever recommend Tolkien's work kind of in a non-academic setting, kind of just for enjoyment? And then do you ever recommend Tolkien as an academic to students or colleagues?
Yes, okay. So I have, yes, of course, I've recommended Tolkien as to general readers, to friends. Often the usual way this is happening is, so what is that crazy, what is that crazy thing you're working on? For people who are not really into what I'm doing, they're just my friends for all sorts of, from all sorts of other social circles, etc. And often, I have to sort of sell Tolkien and say, look, give it a chance. It might sound a bit crazy, but, you might enjoy it. You never know. And the other big recommendation recently, again, because I've got a young child, is giving recommendations to people who say, I am a fan, what do I give first to my child to read? How do I make my child a Tolkien fan? And that's a tough one because it can go very wrong. So fortunately, Tolkien is very good with, what most children are used to at a very young age, which is word and image. He didn't quite do picture books, but he illustrated the Father Christmas letters, for example. There is Mr. Bliss. So there are sort of texts to gently start with a young child and get them to appreciate, what Tolkien is doing. The Hobbit, of course, is a brilliant text, and so is Rob Random. So there's a lot to suggest there. Now, when it comes to students, it really depends. Sometimes the students that will come to you with, usually the students will come to you saying, I want to work on Tolkien, which is fine. And then you sort of work with them to shape the best way to hone their idea and to refine their projects. But sometimes you do get students who want to work, for example, on the effect of the First World War on literary representations, or people who are looking at, or students who are looking at eco-critical perspectives and fantastic texts. So these sorts of topics, Tolkien's work lends itself really, really well to those sorts of topics. And yeah, there are those cases where I will recommend including, one of Tolkien's works in those contexts. But the place where I mostly recommend Tolkien to students is his theoretical work. And I'm talking about on fairy stories really here, which I think very rightly Doug Anderson and Verlin Flieger have called Tolkien's manifesto about fantasy. And it's his understanding of what fantasy is and how it should work. So I very often recommend on fairy stories as today, I suppose, a standard and early and very learned and very rich and complex theorization of a theoretical approach to fantasy, a critical and theoretical approach. And I explain often to students that the first theoretical approaches to fantasy we've had were from fantasy authors, because nobody else was looking at that work very seriously. So we have a whole strand of authors who are trying to sort of explicate and understand their own creativity in that respect. So yes, an extraordinary text and very, very useful to anybody who's studying fantasy.
Excellent. I honestly can't think of that many other respondents who have said that they recommend Tolkien because of his critical perspectives.
There you go. There's your academics perspective here. So there you are.
Well, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. So the last question I have for you today is basically just asking you, are you working on any new Tolkien projects that we can look forward to?
There are a number of things brewing. Some of them I can't talk about yet. Some of them are sort of nearly there. So there's an article on Tolkien and Kipling that's been brewing for a while. And I should have got it out a long time ago, but it's been festering there for a while. And I think I've got it now. I think I've sort of got my head around how it is that I want to structure it and what I want to say. And it's mostly focusing on Tolkien's early work and Kipling's late work. So around the time that they were both writing at the early part of the 20th century. So that's one. There are all sorts of other commitments for papers and things like that. But I think probably the next big book is not going to be a Tolkien one, the way I'm thinking about things. There's going to be a book on miniature characters in children's literature. So Tolkien might just about appear there with the diminutive fairies and the elves in Father Christmas letters. But it's not going to be a main focus, really. It's going to be one of a number of different authors and texts that I'm going to look at.
Wow, that sounds really interesting. So I want to thank you for joining me today and talking through your Tolkien experience. It's been wonderful.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. And this is something I've been meaning to do for a long time. So thanks for making me do it in the end. So there you go.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.